Morning, Mr. Freeman. Looks like you're running late.
In an unassuming former monastery building adjacent to the church of Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan, Italy, there is a wall decorated with the remnants of a mural painted by Leonardo da Vinci. In English, the mural in question is known as The Last Supper, and due to a combination of the oil painting-like techniques employed by da Vinci, which differed considerably from fresco techniques and thus were very unconventional for mural work, together with aspects of the construction and later history of the building, the work is badly damaged. Meanwhile, about 20 minutes away, in a space on an upper floor of the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II shopping complex, next to the Milan Cathedral, at the time of recording this there is an exhibit known as Leonardo Tre, which includes, among other features, a computer-aided reconstruction of what the Last Supper would have looked like at the time of its original completion by da Vinci in 1498. The question I now pose to you, dear viewers, is a simple one. If these were the only two options in existence, which one would you say is what is meant by the phrase, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci? I'd advise you not to be too hasty in your reply. I'll give my own answer to this quandary in due time, and it's almost guaranteed to be an answer you don't expect. But first, I need to take some time to introduce and discuss the main topic of this analysis, Half-Life. And I need to do that in order to adjudicate a similar, superficially straightforward dilemma. The Half-Life remake Black Mesa is a terrific game, is an incredible labor of love, and is the single greatest fan-led project of its kind ever completed. But on top of all of that, does Black Mesa also count as being Half-Life itself?
They're waiting for you, Gordon, in the test chamber.
My first playthrough of Half-Life occurred in 2011. Despite the 13 years of rapid technological advancement that had elapsed between then and its original release, I found the game magnificent and captivating. The atmospheric level, lighting, and sound design drew me into an intense and dangerous world. It led me through a sequence of linear passageways, but by opting for more organic chapters rather than discrete levels, it remained immersive and grounded. Other than an occasional note of dark comedy, its approach to science fiction felt mature and serious. And that maturity in the world building was matched by the aggressive tactics of its enemy AI, the deliberate placement of its health, ammunition, and suit power resources, and the careful tuning of its arsenal, with weapons that escalate in strangeness in parallel with the narrative. Speaking of narrative, its story concerns a science experiment gone exceptionally wrong, and the violent military cover-up that quickly follows, with implications of something even weirder going on peppered throughout, and coming to the forefront at the very end of the game. The way in which Half-Life's presentation of that story is seamlessly integrated into the core experience of its gameplay is absolutely masterful, far surpassing the majority of releases to this day, as games generally continue to present their stories as interruptions to their gameplay rather than elements of it.
So what am I supposed to do, wait around?
Soon after playing the game, I became aware that there exists in the popular response to it a persistent notion that the game is no longer pleasant to play because it is, for them, visually unappealing and mechanically clunky. Having been around long enough to play plenty of 3D games produced during the 1990s, including playing many of them, during the 1990s, I had simply accepted the low-resolution textures, low polygon models, and stiff movement of Half-Life as being the style of the game. But as the years wore on, this idea that Half-Life hadn't aged well, to which I was diametrically opposed, began to attach itself to an even more troublesome corollary. See, in the wake of Valve's underwhelming port of Half-Life to the Source engine in the mid-2000s, a team of fans set out to produce their own remake of Half-Life, with a scope and list of aims which steadily expanded over the years. The eventual goal of the project could be summed up as creating a game that takes full advantage of the newer engine to offer 1. A hugely changed visual and auditory style more in line with that of Half-Life 2 and its episodic follow-ups, 2. A number of minor alterations to unpopular level layouts and puzzle mechanics, and 3. An extensive reimagining of Half-Life's divisive final chapters. This fan-made remake is called Black Mesa, and it started to approach completion in the mid-2010s. Thus, it was in the mid-2010s that the troublesome corollary to which I referred a moment ago began spreading across the web. The new companion to the claim that Half-Life does not hold up well was the claim that, as a result of this alleged poor aging, one should simply play Black Mesa instead. The latter was being taken not merely as a supplementary work, but as an acceptable and even advisable substitute for the former. That sentiment persists wherever games are recommended between people, and when I started encountering it, I found it revolting. Imagine if every single time someone in a film forum said they wanted to watch the 1933 film King Kong, someone always chimed in to tell them that they can just watch the 2005 film King Kong instead. After all, while both films are critically acclaimed, the 1933 movie is in black and white, has special effects that may now be considered unattractive or lacking in realism, and features actors speaking in an affected, largely extinct mid-Atlantic accent.
You know I'm square.
Everybody knows you're square, Denham.
These potential difficulties for a modern audience have been removed in Peter Jackson's remake, which is in color with naturalistic acting and computer-generated effects. And if a newer or more accessible cinematic version of the story is ever produced, that should be preferred instead. Then the viewer can go ahead and say they've basically already seen the original King Kong, or at the very least that they've already seen Jackson's King Kong with the least possible exposure to old things. But the substance of a work inheres in its details. The film being in black and white, the characters having stilted conversations, and most of the effects being stop-motion animated, are some of the elements that make the original King Kong the film that it is. The more such details that are removed or smoothed out, the less that the work is that King Kong. They can only be considered obstacles to watching the film in the same way that the flavor of a meal can be considered an obstacle to eating it. Perhaps some players don't like low-poly art, or tracing lengthy cart rails underneath a facility, or a final set of levels including a sudden change to art style and mechanics. To the degree that that is the case, those players don't like Half-Life. When those things were removed or changed in Black Mesa, that brought about a distancing between it and the original. And the more such alterations were made, the more remade or more remastered it became, the less it was Half-Life. Along these lines, one would never have to wonder why I would avoid directing my analysis of, for instance, Crash Bandicoot, at its iteration in the Insane Trilogy remaster. If the game I am setting out to analyze is Crash Bandicoot, then I will analyze the game containing thoroughly and exclusively the details which make up the original Crash Bandicoot. Only if the game I am setting out to analyze is instead the first title in the Insane Trilogy remaster will I extend any analysis or attention in that direction. One may possibly object to this reasoning, on the grounds that Naughty Dog could have actually intended to create a game that looks like the remastered Crash back in the mid-1990s, yet were unable to do so due to the limitations of contemporary console technology. Given the computing resources available today, Naughty Dog may have produced a work substantially similar to the remastered title and released it under the name Crash Bandicoot. That's as may be. On a similar note, it is also possible that Frida Kahlo was limited in her ability to translate the art she envisioned in her mind onto a canvas by the precise size and shape of the paintbrushes that were available to her. I doubt this is the case, but it is conceivable. As a matter of curiosity, I am interested in the practical limitations against which the works of both Frida Kahlo and Naughty Dog were created. But when it comes time for analysis, for close reading, thematic studies, and hermeneutics, only the details of the work that emerged from the process of creation, whatever quirks and limitations that process included, will be those to which I attend, from the brushstrokes on Kahlo's canvases to the jagged polygons in Crash Bandicoot's physique. But if you've been nodding along until now, then you may be initially displeased by the material that comes next. For while the deferral to the newest remake or remaster as always being a legitimate way of experiencing an original work, provided that the new work is itself of high quality, strikes me as an obvious error, the hardline commitment to the apparently opposite notion that only the work as it was originally released could possibly count as the thing itself runs into numerous problems of its own.
Gordon doesn't need to hear all this. He's a highly trained professional. We've assured the administrator that nothing will go wrong.
As one walks through a gallery of Renaissance paintings, even if one sets aside the group of works left unfinished by their artists, one is still not seeing works as they were originally released. One is seeing representations, modifications, or versions of them. They may have sustained significant damage from warfare, weather, improper storage, or otherwise. They may have been removed from their original locations and/or frames. They may have accreted layers of well-meaning restoration work. They may have been accidentally or surreptitiously switched for copies or forgeries. And even if all of that hasn't happened, they may have deteriorated through more subtle means across the simple passage of time, such as due to humidity or chemical changes in the paint. Nevertheless, one may be tempted to think, as they browse the Louvre, that they are at least privileged to be seeing so many original works of art as they were intended by great artists of the past. They are not, after all, instead viewing a convenient copy of the works in a book or on a web page. Thus, they are still accessing the magical, authentic experience of the works themselves. Or are they? Consider the following words from Walter Benjamin's famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. It is easier to exhibit a portrait bust that can be sent here and there than to exhibit the statue of a divinity that has its fixed place in the interior of a temple. The same holds for the painting as against the mosaic or fresco that preceded it. With the different methods of technical reproduction of a work of art, its fitness for exhibition increased to such an extent that the quantitative shift between its cult value and its exhibition value turned into a qualitative transformation of its nature. By the absolute emphasis on its exhibition value, the work of art becomes a creation with entirely new functions, among which the one we are conscious of, the artistic function, later may be recognized as incidental. Benjamin is speaking of a fundamental change that technology has caused in the role art plays in society, and that change cannot be avoided or reversed by a trip to the museum. A museum, as a publicly accessible exhibition space, is in fact one of the sources of the change according to Benjamin. Now, he doesn't think this change is a bad thing, per se. He wants art to be able to achieve political or social progress, and the so-called artistic function that was being diminished was specifically a reverence of provenance and beauty that he argues acted as a halfway step between the religious significance of art in the distant past and the political significance of art in the present. So, he writes, for the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. For our purposes, the relevant key point here is simply that in an era where changes of that kind have occurred, visitors to the Louvre who feel they are seeing the works in their original forms or format are, in some very real sense, either being deceived or deceiving themselves. Even if every single solitary one of those various forms of damage, displacement, or repair listed a moment ago actually hasn't affected some subset of the Renaissance paintings in question, and even if those works, as is the case with many murals, actually have not moved from their original locations, the works are still being received by individuals whose ideologies, languages, cultures, and often also social statuses differ from those extant among the audiences to whom the paintings were originally presented. An experience of such paintings that strongly resembles the experience of them that was available when they were first created has been, in the famous phrase of Roy Batty,
lost in time like tears in rain.
When I played Half-Life via Steam in 2011, I was playing a version substantially similar to the one from which this footage is drawn. At the time, I thought I was playing the game in its original form. I had deceived myself. I had not actually played the game as it had been released in 1998. Not only had minor bug fixes and optimizations been made consistently over the years, but I had also played the game at a widescreen resolution of 1366 by 768. Relative to what was available in the release version of Half-Life, that resolution is both wider than the largest option, which was 1280 by 960, and at an incorrect aspect ratio. Widescreen display in the original version was offered by stretching or cropping one of the available 4x3 options. Not to mention the fact that, unlike me in 2011, most players in 1998 would have been experiencing the game on a CRT monitor. And people who played the game for the first time between 2013 and 2023 and believe themselves to have experienced the game in its original form might be in an even deeper fog of self-deception, depending on how much research they did prior to playing. As a set of HD models, which had been made freely available on Steam in 2005, based on the graphics of the standalone expansions Blue Shift and Opposing Force, was added into the official release of Half-Life and activated by default in 2013. This decision was not reversed by Valve until the game's 25th anniversary update, a decade later. Personally, before playing, I did no advanced research whatsoever, so it is merely a benevolent quirk of fate that by playing the game in 2011, I played it with its original graphics essentially intact. But what are we to say of people unknowingly playing the game with the alternate models enabled, or at an incorrect aspect ratio? Well, I know what I would have said in the past. I would have said they hadn't actually experienced Half-Life. See, the first draft of this analysis was written 7 years ago. Despite sharing the exact same subject matter and even the exact same title, it was far different from what you are hearing here. In that never-released first draft, I took a naive, hardline purist stance. I was drawing on Walter Benjamin's argument that the ability of works in new art forms, especially photography and film, to fulfill new and important social, revolutionary, and political functions derived in large part from the total interchangeability of every reproduction of one of them. Specifically, the potential of the medium of film that he saw in the 30s lay in film's ability to broadly distribute a particular carefully assembled experience for wide consumption and critical analysis. For games to do the same, I felt that the experiences they offer must have maximal stability. So taking that together with formalist considerations like those in the previous section, back then I boldly wrote that the true Half-Life is therefore only the game exactly as it was released in 1998.
I must remember to report that fluctuation.
That was me missing the forest for the trees when it comes to Benjamin. In chasing that analogy to his discussion of film, I was ignoring his basic argument that an appeal to the authority and authenticity of an original, its aura, as he would render it, is not tenable for a work of art designed for reproducibility. Benjamin made cultural and historical arguments to that effect, and in the next section and what remains of this one, I'll be making technical and philosophical arguments along similar lines. But to begin, let's just take a moment to notice the somewhat amusing fact that that earliest draft of this analysis was written by a version of me who did not know that, by his own standards, he had therefore never played Half-Life. Anyway, using a position like that to define the identity of a game wasn't mistaken merely because it was hypocritical. It was a fundamentally doomed position, because games can't be maximally stable experiences. Even momentarily setting aside the version differences created by both ports to new platforms and incremental updates on live services like Steam, most games come with aesthetic variations baked in through the graphical, audio, and gameplay settings available in the menu. Similarly, games frequently release with differences based on the region in which the player lives. Famously, there was a 10 Hz difference between North American and European consoles for decades due to NTSC and PAL standards that were in use. Cultural and legal differences have often introduced small variations, like the censoring of religious and sexual content when distributing games in the USA, the censoring of violence when distributing games in Germany, and the censoring of all of the above and more when distributing games in China or Australia. Many games have released on multiple platforms simultaneously, with differences big and small on a per-platform basis. And there are even physically distributed games which have been reissued on the same platform in the same region with changes, as in the case of some of the titles included in PlayStation's Greatest Hits series over the years. The earliest version of Half-Life, as sold on disc in 1998, has options to change the game's difficulty, alter its display resolution, download the latest online update of the game, and even toggle visuals inappropriate for younger players, which refers to some of the blood and gore in the game.
Rescued at last, thank God you're here.
Now, for their contributions to art history and culture, the developers of platform emulators should have their praises sung by everyone, and will have their praises sung by everyone with any interest in the medium of games at some point in the future. But even robust, low-level emulation running with carefully selected visual filters and no upscaling on powerful hardware cannot save us from variations that result from patching, multi-platform release, multi-region release, and settings menus. In an ideal world, emulation or meticulous preservationist porting would be the primary ways older games are re-released. Yet we'd still be having this conversation even if that were the case. And we don't live in an ideal world anyway. And beyond all of that, there is the basic matter of gaming's most unique attribute among artistic media, that it is interactive. Even in games containing no randomized elements whatsoever, the exact experience that any given player will have in completing a game may be literally unique to that player alone. Whether the player character turned left or right at a given moment, succeeded quickly, succeeded slowly, or failed at their tasks, and whether they thoroughly explored the game world or rushed to an ending, will all necessarily vary from person to person. There are thousands of people, for instance, walking around in the world saying they have played through Dark Souls without their characters having ever set foot in Ash Lake, let alone Ulasil. There are players who have only ever played melee characters and never explored other mechanics such as archery or magic. There are players who have defeated Gwyn but never fought a Taurus demon. I don't think this is controversial for me to say, but all of the people who have beaten the game have played Dark Souls. Of course they have. In fact, I have a hard time even imagining a purist so pure that they would tell those players they haven't. But what it is for them to have played Dark Souls is far different from what it is for a completionist to have done the same. That fuzziness between the experiences of individual consumers is inextricable from the act of consuming art. It is simply drawn out more clearly than usual in the medium of games, where one routinely discusses artworks as having optional content. Along these lines, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction shows itself to be incredibly prescient when, while covering the effects of the increasing historical proliferation of literature, literacy, and expertise, Benjamin declares, "Thus, the distinction between author and public is about to lose its basic character. The difference becomes merely functional. It may vary from case to case. At any moment, the reader is ready to turn into a writer." The degree to which every player of a game is actively involved in the production of their own experience of that game is the loudest knell ever sounded for the death of the author.
Be quiet. This thing hears us.
Ultimately, in a world of day one patches, early access, and games as a service, insisting on experiencing games as they were originally released becomes either a quaint bit of trivia or a quixotic impossibility, rather than a defense of art. Aside from certain speedrunners and MMO players, the quest to access such absolute earliest versions will increasingly become the domain of academic curiosity. Just as I was deceived into thinking I had played and appreciated the true original Half-Life in 2011, so you may possibly have been deceived into thinking you saw the original Last Supper, however damaged, in the introduction earlier. But even that version, the one now available in the former monastery next to the church of Santa Maria della Grazia, has undergone massive restoration efforts. Here's what the painting looked like in the 1970s, by which time it had in turn already received an enormous amount of restoration attention in the preceding centuries. In fact, by then, the painting had already existed for over twice as long without the section below the table in the center, which was removed to make room for a doorway in 1652, as it had existed with it. And again, owing to Da Vinci's insistence on using a method closer to oil painting than fresco, the deterioration of the work began almost immediately upon completion, and was significant and blatant within just a few decades. According to the testimony of 16th century art historian Giorgio Vasari, the original painting had simply flaked away into an unrecognizable blur by the end of the 1500s. Anyone in the here and now who is willing to claim that they have seen The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, that they know what it looks like, is required to admit they are willing to accept something other than the original work as completed by the artist as being the work itself. Perhaps they are referring to the repeatedly diminished and restored mural standing in the monastery. Perhaps they are referring to a good faith attempt at reconstructing the appearance of the original work, like that exhibited in Leonardo Tre. Perhaps they are even referring to a more durable copy of the original work by another artist, such as the one by Jean Pietrino or the one by Andrea Solari. In a similar vein, there are a great many people today saying that they have played Half-Life without having played the game as released in 1998. They comprise a set that I believe is accurately representing reality when they say they have played Half-Life, and it is a set that contains me. But now it is time for the last swing of the pendulum. For even in light of the realistic and pragmatic concerns raised here, I feel a need to bring the material in this section and the material in the prior section together into some kind of general principle, before I will be ready to close the question of whether those who have only played Black Mesa belong in that set.
They said it was hauled from the Challenger Deep, but I'm positive that beast never swam in terrestrial waters until a week ago.
For the past couple sections, we have been skating along the surface of a lake, which is remarkably deep. It's now time to plunge our heads and look down. What, in general, makes something distinct from all other things of the same type? What makes one giraffe different from a similar giraffe? What makes me different from you? And, yes, what makes one game different from another? Obviously, we are not hoping to capture the similarities among all things of a given high-level type, the common nature or universal category that includes them all and sets them apart from other types, giraffes, humans, games. Rather, we're trying to capture the differences among entries within a category. We want to know what picks out a particular entity as being distinct and individual. We're looking for a principle of individuation. Perhaps, as a first attempt, we could make a list of elements that are unique to the entry under study, and shared by no other. For instance, it is conceivable, and even likely, that no human being other than you has the patterns of fingerprints and iris coloration that you have. But such unique details are clearly not the totality of what makes you you, rather than someone else. After all, if you were to lose your fingers or your eyes, you would not cease to be you. So they are not necessary conditions for something to be you. But nor are they sufficient. A list of those truly unique elements, naturally, would not include things which are clearly part of your being you, but which are shared among you and others. A hypothetical entity with your fingerprints and iris coloration, but which has no internal organs, fails to be you. Somehow, what we really want to capture is all conceivable details of the individual, both unique and common, which, when taken together, mark them out as being only themselves. Two promising methods of doing this, at least since the work of Aristotle, have been to point to the matter of the individual or to point to the form of the individual. In a doctrine that now bears the attractive name hylomorphism, Aristotle contends that matter and form are the two parts of which every particular thing is a compound. Let's start with matter. Can matter be the principle of individuation for which we're searching? Well, this is initially a very promising idea. Considering the example from a moment ago, if we were to specify not only that a being must have organs to be you, but that a being must have your organs to be you, we seem to be getting somewhere. It does seem to be the case that any given entity, such as one particular giraffe, at any given time has or is a distinct parcel of matter, and that the way in which that is true sets that entity off from all other entities with overlapping features. In terms of strict metaphysical possibility, however, it is perfectly conceivable, though incredibly unlikely, that at another time, in the distant future perhaps, a second giraffe could come about which has the exact same parcel of matter as the giraffe under study has now. Well, you may fairly remark that this notion of the same matter being used by two different entities of the same type at different times seems like a pretty contrived and unlikely objection. Maybe it poses a problem for professional philosophers specializing in metaphysics who are seeking a rock-solid principle of individuation, but for everyday, practical, pragmatic purposes, it may still seem like matter is good enough to formally distinguish and set apart the identity of one thing from all other things of its kind.
It's probably not a problem. Probably, but I'm showing a small discrepancy in... well, no, it's well within acceptable bounds again.
Matter, however, encounters an even bigger obstacle to being the principle we're seeking when we come to consider our main topic: necessarily reproducible artworks like books, films, and games. When we want to know what makes one giraffe different from the rest of the species at a given time, the matter involved is clear enough. But when we want to know what makes, say, Things Fall Apart different from all other novels or stories, the matter involved is, to put it mildly, less clear. Every copy of a given edition of a book has equal claim to being that edition of that book, and just about everyone in the world would accept a copy of a book as also being, at least in some sense, the book itself. To put it into terms introduced by C.S. Peirce, we are not interested in what makes my token, or copy, or individual instance of Things Fall Apart be the token that it is, but rather what makes the type, or narrative, or novel that is Things Fall Apart be the type that it is. Yet a particular edition of a novel simply is a sequence of words, and whether that sequence is etched into stone or spoken aloud, it remains recognizable as being the novel that it is. Though tied more immutably to certain platforms, the same is ultimately true of films being a sequence of images and sounds, rather than, say, a film reel, and games being the experiential interface of an underlying rule set and code, rather than, say, a NES cartridge. Granted, there is, at any given time, including the partial contents of hard drives and libraries around the world, a subset of matter that corresponds to all extant copies of a particular book, film, or game. But it is an arbitrarily telescoping set which can be added to or subtracted from according to the will or whim of interested agents. It does not seem to draw a line around the identity of the work in the way that your matter at any given moment seems to do for you. And at any rate, that kind of loose conceptual amalgamation of all existing copies of Things Fall Apart does not seem to be what people actually mean when they talk about the book, what the book is like, whether it is a good book, any possible meaning of the book, and so forth. And in the case of a memorizable artwork like a novel, holding to that position would lead to strange consequences, such as some of the matter that constitutes particular works arguably being matter that is inside of human brains. And zeroing in on our primary focus here, often no singular definitive physical copy of a game precedes mass production, if there is ever a physical copy at all apart from the atomic presence of the storage of the data on various hard drives. Even if one is speaking of the source code, which it is fairly trivial to demonstrate is not what almost anyone is trying to refer to when they refer to a game in general discourse, that code is often duplicated across multiple workstations. Ultimately, unless we are dealing with a rare collectible, or one of them is broken, a person usually doesn't much care what makes one copy of Ratchet & Clank for the PlayStation 2 different from another same release version, same region copy of Ratchet & Clank for the PlayStation 2. What we are trying to figure out, rather, is what makes the HD release of Ratchet & Clank for the PlayStation 3 different from Ratchet & Clank for the PlayStation 2, and how, if at all, that affects its identity. Accordingly, what we want to know about is an identity that isn't necessarily tied to all of a work's currently associated matter, nor to any particular subset of its currently associated matter. That's a shame. It seemed like such a promising answer.
Do you still say there's nothing to chaos theory?
So, if matter isn't going to help us, then where do we turn? Well, Thomas Ainsworth describes the situation thus. We have seen that there are some textual reasons to think Aristotle makes matter his principle of individuation. But in fact, particular forms are better suited to play this role. We need to distinguish between two different questions, one about unification, the other about individuation. 1. What makes this giraffe, or this giraffe matter, one and the same giraffe over time? 2. What makes this giraffe distinct from that one? The first question does not obviously require an answer that is unique to the giraffe in question. Giraffeness, in general, may well suffice. The answer to the second question, however, cannot be the universal species, since it is common to both giraffes. Nor can it be their matter, since they could, albeit improbably, be composed of the numerically same stuff at different times. It is not so obvious that Aristotle sees the need to address the second question. But if his forms are particular, not universal, he is in a good position to do so. Alright, what is this better-suited avenue referenced by Ainsworth? Particular forms. First, what is something's form, as opposed to its matter? Form is not just shape, but also structure, and possibly also function. Form is the way that something is arranged in the world, the way, for instance, that your matter is arranged to constitute the existence of you. A universal form, which philosophers often just call a universal, is a grandiose way of referring to a property or category that is shared by multiple things. For example, if two objects are both rectangular, then rectangularity may be the universal that binds them together in some way. A particular form, on the other hand, would be a form that is unique to a single thing, the form of you, as opposed to the form of me. That is to say, the particular form of you is the shape, structure, and perhaps also function that your matter instantiates.
Still, it's better than going naked in this place.
This latter notion of a particular form is another promising answer to our predicament. But once again, when we turn our attention away from tokens, like your copy of a game or mine, to types, like the game itself considered apart from any specific copy, complications arise. A minor complication is that there's a bit of linguistic confusion here that needs to be ironed out. My usage of the technical terms token and type may mislead you into thinking there could never be a particular form of something like a story or a game that I've called a type. After all, if a particular form is a form that is unique to a single thing, and a type is a class of things, then surely we're speaking of the universal form of those things instead. But notice what I actually just said. A type is a class of things. It's not things, it's a class of things. Class is singular there. It's the particular form of that thing, the class, which we'll be discussing here. This confusion ultimately arises from the fact that there is some ambiguity in the words particular and universal. They're always relative in their application. For example, if we're discussing the universal category animal, then we might speak of human as a particular. But we could just as easily discuss the universal category human, and you as a particular. Notice that this is possible even for Ainsworth's example, as one could speak of being part of a specific giraffe as a universal, and say one of that giraffe's legs as a particular. So you could say that we're seeking the universal form that all copies of a given game share, Or you could say, what I will be saying, that we're seeking the particular form which only a given game has. The distinction there is in the words, not the concepts. But even with that clarification in mind, there's a more important complication. The remaining concern takes the form of the following question, and it is the actual question underlying this entire analysis. What is the particular form of a game? In other words, which aspects of the shape, structure, and function of a game, which of its aesthetics and mechanics, constitute its particular form? If the answer is absolutely every aspect, every detail, all of them without exception, then the particular form is the work exactly as it was originally released, and we are back in the realm of the purist or idealist stance lambasted earlier on. A second edition of a novel that does nothing but correct a few typos in the first edition would be a new, distinct, separate novel, and every minuscule bug fix patch distributed online releases a game that is brand new. Half-Life fans who wish that there were more entries in the series may welcome that consequence, as it would mean there are actually already hundreds of Half-Life games officially produced by Valve. But the rest of us are likely to see that as an untenable definition. Conversely, if the particular form is a loose category that contains only some essential subset of the details of the original work, which seems to be where the earlier Pragmatist or Realist section is leading, then a new issue surfaces. How do we select this essential subset? Consider the following summary by Aaron Smuts. The general worry for the type theory of story identity is that just as it is difficult to decide when a story should fall under a general type, it will be difficult to say when we should consider something the same story. If the type theory of story identity is to be viable, it must provide a principled explanation of where we can draw the line that is not based on salience. Smuts feels the line between one story and another cannot be based on salience, that is, on how seemingly important or memorable particular details are, for several reasons. Because salience may be a quirk of any particular version of a story, because salience will vary from person to person, and because salience may even vary from reading to reading. But at last, this is where I am ready to retreat to the realm of the everyday, the practical, and the pragmatic. I agree with Smuts that through current paradigms it will be basically impossible to uncontroversially establish the particular form of a given story or game. But I'm not troubled by that. I'm comfortable with controversy, and I'm comfortable with a definition of particular form that allows it to vary from person to person in relation to a given work. Thus, I am willing to accept salience as the solution, and to be, in Smuts' phrase, unprincipled in my explanation.
I'm just going to wait out the catastrophe in here. If you intend to go on, then I beg of you, proceed with extreme caution.
In a way of discussing the situation that may be derived from the work of Thomas Aquinas, it is necessarily in the abstraction of the mind that one thing may ever be recognizably the same as another thing. After all, something being recognizably the same requires at least a hypothetical recognizer. So it is from a specific perspective, yours, for instance, and not from some place of neutral objective authority that such a determination can be made. As a result, it is, in a perhaps unsatisfying conclusion for some, almost definitively subjective. The metaphysicians may continue to argue to the end of time as to whether these human perspectives are actually discussing a real property or set of properties shared by the particular object in question, or are discussing something that has no real existence outside the mind. But that's of no special consequence to me as I live my life. I'll never be able to step outside of my mind to get a glimpse of reality itself, apart from my experience of it. And even that terminology of a glimpse helps to reveal the truth of this sentiment. Thus, whether universals are real or imaginary is one of the many debates that cannot be conclusively won. It's just not possible to know whether there is any ultimate, transcendent difference between the concept recognizably the same and the concept the same. Not possible to know whether sameness is a property of reality itself or just a property of reality as it is perceived, because we only have access to reality as it is perceived. But that unreachable reality apart from perception, the noumenon, or thing in itself in the phrase of Kant, the transcendental signified in the phrase of Derrida, is not what concerns me. All that matters to me is the world that I perceive, the world in which I live. Therefore, for all intents and purposes, what a thing is what it appears to be. Not just how it appears on its surface, but how it appears to all human attention and investigation. I don't know what the most important elements or set of elements is for establishing the specific identity of a game, and neither do you. Yet, for all that, I feel capable of establishing principles whereby, when presented with two works, I can make a determination for myself as to whether they are or are not the same work. Now, I imagine you want to see what this subjectivity-based solution looks like in practice. Well, then it is finally time to move on to the last main section of this analysis.
You're not authorized to know about those, but I can see you already know a great deal more than any one man is supposed to.
Our central questions have been revealed to be these. What is the particular form of a game? And when does a variant of a game get to be said to share that game's particular form? I have now argued that there can be no objective answer to these questions. Or, at the very least, that no human will ever have access to an objective answer to these questions, whether or not there are any. But all is not lost. At the end of the day, perhaps all we really need or want is to be able to communicate our thoughts and considerations about different works to each other. For that, if we simply choose and use them, subjective answers to these questions could work just fine. Due to the issues discussed in the first few sections here, a subjective answer that is purist in nature, while perfectly coherent, won't work, simply because it would be pragmatically useless. A purist answer won't allow people to communicate their thoughts and considerations about different works, as practically no one would be able to say they've played a given game, seen a given film, or read a given book. Thus, ideally, the subjective answer we accept will be an answer which itself enshrines the subjectivity involved, as a discouragement to the bickering of the most stubborn originalists. To that end, here's an answer to the first question. The particular form of a game is the set of details that constitute the experience of a game. Is this just a tautology, saying that a game is a game? No, as we have introduced the concept of detail and related it to experience. This answer is not a rulebook that will let people access objective truth. It's a guiding principle that will help people pinpoint their own intuitions. And here's an answer to the second question. A variant of a game gets to be considered the same game if it is perceived as being a good faith and credibly successful effort to preserve with minimal alteration the salient mechanics, sounds, and visuals of the work. So, to spell out the relationship between the second answer and the first one, the mechanics, sounds, and visuals that are salient to a player are the details that make up a game's experience. In other words, to be considered the same game, two works must provide recognizably the same experience. In the world of paintings, the analogous situation to the second answer would be the fruits of the subtlest, most skillful, and least presumptuous art restoration efforts. Note that despite it leaning so heavily on subjectivity, this is actually still a pretty strict standard. Even though you will very rarely be literally experiencing a work exactly as it was originally released, this standard still says that for what you experience to count as that same work, it has to seem to you that its aim is to present the work as close as possible or as close as reasonable to its original form, hence good faith effort, and has to give you no obvious indication that it is failing at that, hence credibly successful effort. For those who accept this standard, almost every remake and the majority of remasters may fail to meet it. Now, you can take or leave these answers as you like, but first, watch me put them to use, with a practical demonstration of what I declared a little while ago about being comfortable with controversy.
This is my hiding spot, and I'm not moving until the situation is drastically improved.
Metroid Zero Mission is not the same game as Metroid. Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories is not the same game as Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories. Bluepoint's Demon's Souls is not the same game as From Software's Demon's Souls. Despite the clarifications of the previous two sections, I've said those things before, and I'll likely say them all again. They may be similar creations, but they do not share identity as the exact same artwork. To me, it does not seem that the details which constitute the experience of the games in question are sufficiently present in their paired examples, because I do not perceive those three remasters or remakes to be good faith and credibly successful efforts to preserve with minimal alteration the salient mechanics, sounds, and visuals of the works. Unsatisfying? Possibly, but in accordance with the definitions I'm using, I am open to being convinced that I am wrong about any of these determinations. Clearly, I have not settled any arguments here today. What I am offering is a set of subjective guidelines that people can use to make such decisions for themselves, and to advance such arguments. And at any rate, although those particular remasters and remakes seem to me to fall short of the standard I've proposed, it must be granted by everyone that there is a range of acceptable variations which do not cause the drawing of that kind of hard distinction. If any of us are to ever be able to say that we have seen The Last Supper, or watched King Kong, or played Half-Life, then we will have to become comfortable with some level of ambiguity, with the fact that there are many subtly differing yet legitimate forms of any given work. While I neither intend to justify nor condone the nearly 40 years of censored releases it endured, I still feel it would be foolish to declare that no one saw King Kong between 1934 and its uncensored re-release in 1970. Most would agree that nearly all possible combinations of graphics settings and nearly all official update versions of a game qualify for status as being the game itself. And I feel that should be obvious enough to cause the most staunch of originalists some pause. A game can perhaps be considered to be in a prolonged state of public development as official updates and expansions continue to roll out. Moreover, straightforward ports to comparable or more powerful platforms and engines, as well as nearly all official regional variants, or localizations, typically fulfill the proposed requirement as well. Such ports of a game are sort of like different editions or translations of a novel. And finally, and this is where things get a little wild for the purists, on this paradigm, sometimes particularly subtle remasters, volunteer translations of works without official localization, emulated versions with or without CRT filters for older titles and with or without moderate hardware upscaling for 3D titles, and even games with subdued community mods that target technical details like an increased frame rate or an adjusted aspect ratio, qualify as equivalent experiences too.
Bit of a gamble, but we need the extra resolution.
How about some more examples? Have a look at the Zelda series. The recent remaster or remake of Link's Awakening for the Switch does not count for me as exactly the same game as Link's Awakening. Yet the remasters of Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and Skyward Sword released in the past decade do qualify for me as presentations of the games themselves. Along the same lines, even if I don't like most of the changes involved, I nevertheless feel compelled to admit that Dark Souls Remastered absolutely remains Dark Souls. Now, you may ask, how am I personally drawing this line? How do I decide that the symphonically covered music and harsh bloom-heavy look of Wind Waker HD count as presentations of the aesthetics of the original Wind Waker, but the orchestrally reimagined music and busy, dilapidated look of Blue Point's Demon Souls don't count as presentations of the aesthetics of the original Demon Souls? Both are clear approximations, and neither significantly alters gameplay after all. Well, I'm happy to answer, but you'll find that, for reasons now well established, it's not a precise scientific process. First, I try to determine what I consider to be the salient mechanics, sounds, and visuals of a game. To do this, depending on the circumstances, I may play the game again, or else I may simply think of the experience of playing it and see what I remember and what stands out to me among those memories. Either way, I consider what the details of the game are, and how those details come together to establish its themes. But, at least in most situations, it's not as though I make a formal list of such details. I'm just, after the fact, putting myself mentally within whatever remains in my head of the feelings and experiences I had when interacting with the work. The elements of that remaining mental experience are the elements I find salient about it. Next, I consider the experience of a newer work that may or may not share the target game's identity, and I decide whether or not I perceive that a good faith and credibly successful effort has been made to preserve with minimal alteration all of those salient elements. That's the definition I have accepted, so that's the best answer I am able to give.
You've come this far. You know as much about these creatures as anyone.
Those of you knowledgeable about the Zelda series may have felt I made a convenient omission when discussing Link's Awakening a moment ago. The differences between Link's Awakening from 2019 and Link's Awakening from 1993 are fairly dramatic. But what about Link's Awakening DX from 1998? Do the added colors, additional music, new optional dungeon, new optional side quest, and slightly altered secret ending of Link's Awakening DX make it a genuinely different game from Link's Awakening? Or does the fact that the two are otherwise functionally identical preserve their shared identity? I have made my own decision about this, but it's a close enough call that, instead of blurting it out, I've decided that some of my points here are better supported by leaving this one as an exercise for the viewer. So, let me know. Are they the same game? In service of questions like that one, I provide my criterion here so that people may, if they so desire, choose to employ it when deciding for themselves about particular works. But even in cases that seem straightforward to most people, there will never be unanimous agreement. As I said earlier, salience will vary from person to person. It is better to accept this than to fight it. It is better to recognize this state of affairs than to pretend that one's statements about this topic are objective. As when arguing the definitions of genres, the quest to establish unquestionable objectivity is a futile one which can and will draw people into ceaseless debates. And speaking of debates, the content of this section should not be construed as saying there can be no preferences or questions of priority among versions, even if the standards presented here would consider them to share identity as essentially one and the same work, or, if you prefer, editions of the same work. For instance, even though I maintain that Dark Souls Remastered counts as being Dark Souls itself, I personally have a strong preference for many textures, all lighting, and all fire effects in the Prepare to Die edition. I also prefer the GameCube version of Wind Waker to the HD release, primarily thanks to the earlier version actually providing, rather than unevenly approximating, cell shading. Meanwhile, over in the world of film, though I consider them all to be legitimate versions that share identity with the excellent films to which each of them correspond, I will always actively discourage first-time viewers from selecting the theatrical cut of Blade Runner, the director's cut of Donnie Darko, or the Redux cut of Apocalypse Now. Legitimate or not, I still consider them to be inferior experiences of those works. While a good faith effort has been made to preserve with minimal alteration the salient details of these works, the relative success of such attempts is arguable.
How long can you possibly stay here?
We'll stay forever.
Now, on the subject of first-time viewers, it may reasonably be asked how a person should, in general, determine which version of a thing to start with. Well, first I'd say that there's typically no significant harm for most people in simply starting by playing, watching, or reading whichever version is ready to hand, and then only investigating further if interested or better informed. But if you want to know my personal policy, it's this. Except in situations where I believe the original or all early versions to be damaged or lost, I always prioritize credible originals and direct ports or prints for my first experience of a work, initially avoiding all remasters, remakes, reimaginings, and re-edits if possible. Translations are harder to avoid, but it is at least often possible to opt for subtitles rather than dubbing. Yet, as the foregoing example of Blade Runner, whose theatrical cut may actually be its worst version, clearly demonstrates, a person may still fail at making a good first choice by following this policy.
Whatever was in the bathtub was not human.
This too is a rule of thumb, not a law. I nevertheless feel such a policy offers the most favorable probability of actually experiencing any given notable, influential, or culturally relevant work one sets out to experience. As much as I might earnestly wish that rights holders looking to re-release past works would focus on historical preservation, on providing experiences that resemble the original works as closely as possible, while resisting the temptation to dress the works up to match contemporary tastes or technologies, unfortunately that is a less common phenomenon, at least for games. So, for me, seeking out a credible instance of the original work, or a credible facsimile, or an emulated representation, or a direct port to another platform or format, is a worthwhile effort. Note that, for games, for reasons now belabored, by original work here I generally mean a version that includes official patches and expansions from its development team on its platform of origin, not a 1.0 release. In the fullness of time, provided humanity has been prudent and intelligent enough to preserve access to them, the various iterations, versions, or variations of a given game may perhaps be considered by scholars as something akin to the extant renditions of an ancient myth, or the array of differing quarto and folio versions of each of Shakespeare's plays. But here as there, at times it would be necessary to provide or invoke some criteria in order to make taxonomical or clarifying discernments between similar, distinct works. And while I would hope this goes without saying, Just for absolute clarity, a game not sharing identity with an older work it resembles doesn't mean it's automatically bad, nor even automatically worse than the older work. I consider Rebirth superior to Flash Isaac. I consider some of the remakes in the Pokemon series superior to their respective counterparts. I like Zero Mission and the original Metroid about the same amount, as each has its own strengths. A judgment of identity and a judgment of quality are separate judgments.
Freeman, right? I've got a message for you. Make sure you don't...
Some will surely say that the line I'm drawing is merely the distinction between a remaster and a remake, but again, things are not that simple. For instance, the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane trilogy and Spyro Reignited trilogy, which I feel are clearly distinct works from the originals due to dramatic aesthetic differences, with new voice acting, new animations, new models, new textures, new enemy and NPC designs, and sometimes new areas, are marketed and generally construed as remasters, not remakes, due to the overlaps in narrative, level design, and mechanics. In light of such edge cases, folks are eager to offer technical criteria, like saying that a game is a remake rather than a remaster if it is in a different engine, or if new art assets were made, or if gameplay was altered. Yet Wind Waker HD, which is an experience that's extremely similar to that of the original and which is thus broadly considered a simple remaster, has new art assets, and has slightly altered gameplay. And Half-Life Source, with the community bug fix patch for it, which is an experience that's extremely similar to that of the original and which is thus broadly considered a simple port, is in a new engine, and has slightly altered gameplay. So, while details like whether the primary selling points of a project are similarities to an original or differences from an original can provide rough guidance, subjectivity is the only answer that is ultimately both accurate and honest. Still, many will continue to adhere, privately or publicly, to those kinds of technical criteria, feeling that even if such rules sometimes have weird consequences, like forcing their adherents to declare differing localizations to be remakes or remasters of each other, at least they offer a modicum of objectivity. That's fine, provided those who make that choice understand that their decision to favor any given criteria is not objective. Now, I know that some people may find it uncomfortable to hear that the decision to apply specific technical or scientific criteria is, in this situation, no less arbitrary or subjective than any other decision made for the situation with rigor or reasoning. But that should be no cause for alarm, as this is far from the only part of art, or indeed life, in which one must defer to the guidance of experience, emotion, or preference.
Why do we all have to wear these ridiculous ties?
And on the subject of terminology, it's not entirely clear that trying to smuggle one game's identity into the identity of an existing game by calling it a remaster of the existing game ever actually makes sense. The word remaster, in the realms of music and film, typically refers to the fact that there still exist maximum resolution or maximum fidelity tracks from the original mastering process. As early release versions of songs and movies have often been limited or compressed to meet the requirements of contemporary distribution formats, new releases of the same works can sometimes be the result of a remastering process, wherein professionals return to those raw tracks or recordings and produce something more faithful which has been made possible by newer distribution formats and related technologies. Outside of fringe cases for which uncompressed texture and audio files can be found and implemented, a game cannot be made more faithful in that way. Generally, only an act of additional interpretation or interpolation on the part of a studio can produce a higher level of detail in a so-called remaster of a game. In other words, in the strictest sense, games may not be remasterable.
It wasn't meant to do this in the first place.
Now, obviously, they are remasterable, because everyone is going to continue using the word remaster in the wider sense implied by its application to games. Language evolves with usage, and it's fruitless to oppose that. I'm just highlighting the fact that, due to that wider sense, when applied to games, the words remaster and remake are arguably now synonyms, differing in connotation rather than denotation. They're both active, interpretive alterations of a game. Which word is chosen seems only to clarify whether the changes are thought to be subtle or thought to be blatant. Determining if any particular work shares identity with an original, then, is all about that perception of sufficiently subtle difference. Now, there are many topics in philosophy considering similar questions of identity that could be brought to bear here, such as the ship of Theseus, or the notion of hexiety. But for some reason, the one it most prompts me to consider is the Sorites paradox, otherwise known as the paradox of the heap. How many grains of sand can be removed from a heap of sand before it transitions from being a heap of sand to not being a heap of sand? Any specific line drawn will always be arbitrary and contrary to logic. There will always be edge cases where deciding between heap and not heap due to the difference of a single grain seems baseless. And yet, for all that, if everyone were to simply select a rule to follow, however arbitrary, then in everyday life they would be able to consistently discuss and make determinations about what is and isn't a heap. And speaking of sand, for all the implied finality and authority of drawing a line in the sand, where, when, and how to draw such a proverbial line is a necessarily individual and fragile task. I've drawn such a line in the past 2 sections, and will operate according to it in the conclusion that follows. But soon after that, I wouldn't be surprised to see someone else wander out onto the same shore, and, with a swift movement, erase my line in order to draw their own.
Most of the simulation results are perfectly acceptable, you know?
Still, before they do anything hasty, I'd ask that they first think about the clips they've seen throughout this analysis. Unlike most of the videos I've made before, and most of the videos I'll make after, this video intentionally lacks labels identifying each clip. This is an analysis considering how we go about identifying the artworks we encounter. And so, I confess that if you've been watching the screen, I've done a small experiment on you. Perhaps you've recognized a great many games, films, and paintings shown here. But can you be sure they're what you thought they were? That they're what I implied they were? And if you felt confident you were seeing an original when you were actually seeing a much later port, or a game whose rendering resolution was altered by an emulator, or even a remaster, what would that mean?
Time to choose. It's time to choose.
Alright, here's the moment of truth. 4 examples have been questioned throughout this analysis as to their ability to impart the experience of particular works. 2 ostensible versions of The Last Supper, and 2 ostensible versions of Half-Life. So let's list them off and give each of them a straightforward, direct answer. Now that everyone watching this has been reminded recently with great clarity of the fact that these are answers given from a necessarily subjective perspective, I can rest assured that I can safely state them without inviting any ire from the viewer whatsoever. Here we go. Does the mural in the former monastery satisfy the meaning of the phrase "The Last Supper" by Leonardo da Vinci? Yes, I would say it does. Does the attempted recreation in Leonardo Tre satisfy the meaning of the phrase "The Last Supper" by Leonardo da Vinci? Well, prepare for a potentially surprising response. Yes, I would say it does. I feel that both the restored mural and the digital recreation satisfy the criterion from a moment ago. They both represent good faith and credibly successful attempts to resemble Da Vinci's Last Supper as closely as possible. They both possess the salient details which impart what I take to be the experience of the work. The poses, proportions, and positioning of the figures and objects. The color relationships. The depth, character, and details of the faces. People who have seen either work, whether in person or via reproduction, can, in my opinion, consistently and truthfully say that they have seen The Last Supper. As that probably now includes you, I suppose I should say, congratulations.
I am impressed.
On to the games. Does the periodically updated, high-resolution game available on Steam under the name Half-Life count as Half-Life? Yes, I would say it does. While I might personally rejoice that the game has returned to having the so-called HD pack disabled by default, I would even begrudgingly admit that I do not feel the alterations it introduces are quite significant enough to say that the game is not Half-Life. And does the newer engine, ground-up remake available on Steam under the name Black Mesa count as Half-Life? Drumroll please. No, I would say it does not. Despite all my jabs at purists, my hedging and backpedaling, and my harping on about pragmatic and realistic circumstances, I nevertheless feel secure saying that Black Mesa does not represent a good faith and incredibly successful attempt to present a work resembling Half-Life as closely as possible. That was, of course, never its aim. Hence its altered level layouts, its completely new Zen chapters, its expanded and re-recorded voice lines, its remade textures and models, its reworked mechanics and puzzles, its new music, and so on. Black Mesa is a great game, but its incredibly numerous differences from Half-Life are precisely its reasons for existing. The experiences are not interchangeable, and in my opinion, should not be treated as such.
What the hell are these things, man? And why are they wearing science team uniforms?
So, there are plenty of people who should relax a bit about whether players on emulators, or on low settings, or with an unlocked frame rate, or without optional content, are getting the true experience of a game. But there are also people who should stop pushing interested individuals away from old art. Now, I've spent the majority of this analysis on the technical task of tearing down, and then reconstituting in a more useful form, the subdiscipline of metaphysics related to establishing the identity of particular games as particular artworks. But what I'd like to leave you with is actually a turn back toward the theoretical angle that energized Walter Benjamin to write about the promise and danger of the similar transitional moment in which he was writing nearly 100 years ago. Earlier, much futile thought had been devoted to the question of whether photography is an art. The primary question, whether the very invention of photography had not transformed the entire nature of art, was not raised. Soon the film theoreticians asked the same ill-considered question with regard to the film. But the difficulties which photography caused to traditional aesthetics were mere child's play as compared to those raised by the film. As from photography to film, so from film to games. The thoroughgoing involvement of the consumer of an artwork in the production of the artistic experience has never been harder to ignore, more blatant, more inescapable than in games. The way that the meaning of art is a cooperative creation between the content of an artwork and an audience member experiencing and interpreting that content has simply never been clearer. In most modern games, it is practically impossible to participate without engaging, at least at some minimal level, in a casual kind of improvisational acting. An exploratory, immersed yet critically distant, credulous yet ironic activity, which folks have taken to calling role-playing. In games, we are asked to take on roles, to control particular characters or objects, and we do this willingly, though we never truly lose sight of ourselves outside the game wearing the virtual costumes. A decade before self-conscious works like BioShock and Spec Ops: The Line came along and raised outright the question of how much control players really exercise over the things games are asking them to do, players young and old were faced with the obvious non-option of whether or not to collaborate with the G-Man, within the manifest constraints of a game so self-consciously linear that it both begins and ends in a railcar, and after one of its longest chapters toward the middle was both titled and centered on a rail. And yet, for all that restriction, for all its scripted set pieces and circumstances, Half-Life remains an experience more variable and interactive than any non-game work of art. Thus, while the passive, uncritical mode of reception which Benjamin feared was all too common among filmgoers certainly can be practiced by folks playing games, I would argue that it is nonetheless basically antithetical to the medium. What you are being tasked to do in the Black Mesa research facility is something that you never really forget you are being tasked to do, in your role as Gordon Freeman.
Ah, hello, Gordon Freeman. It's good to see you.
The stories that games tell us are always in part stories that we tell ourselves, and in part stories about ourselves, in which we act and improvise. This accounts for why some players over the past 20 years have become so sensitive to perceived differences in ideology between themselves and the games they play. They detect a disconnect or dissonance between themselves and their storytelling partner. They are being forced to confront their own socio-political priorities as rules of action and interaction, in a way that is not demanded of them by, say, a film with a perceived message with which they disagree. One can only hope that, with time, players will become more flexible. more accustomed to encountering games that represent a diversity of design, a diversity of thought, and a diversity of people. In closing, this analysis is an examination of the attributes of the work of art in the age of post-release modification. But by that phrase, I should not be understood as meaning only the unusually fine gradations of change between versions that modern distribution methods provide. Changes of source code or assets in bug fixes, mods, ports, updates, remasters, remakes, and so on. Those things, in addition to my mapping of those phenomena onto processes like the degradation, movement, and restoration of paintings, have lent nuance to my stance that the identity of a reproducible artwork, its particular form, inheres in the details that produce its experience. But by post-release modification, I also mean the way in which games, as such identifiable experiences, are modified immediately and in an ongoing fashion after their release, by every moment of play that occurs within them.